name is Rachel Allen. I'm a professor of humanities here on the East Campus, and we're glad you're here today. It looks like we have some people visiting from off campus, which is wonderful. We're glad you're here. I am honored to be the recipient of the Patricia Havel-Wallen Endowed Chair in the Social Sciences. And with that opportunity, it sounds fancy, doesn't it? Yeah. And with that opportunity, I took the opportunity to invite Dr. George Lopez from Notre Dame University here to Valencia. We met George, and I do call him George, and you'll see why when you find out a little more about George. A couple of years ago at Notre Dame, we sent a team of faculty, and Celine, who's here in the front, was with me. To find out a little bit more about this growing field in academia called peace studies. We had colleagues here going, what? Peace studies? Because we've been studying war, in depth for centuries, and we're really good at it. And really this endeavor of studying peace is really new. It really is. It's sort of a post-World War II endeavor. And so I went to Notre Dame and was fascinated. A year later, we took another team there, and it has expanded my horizons, really beyond belief, truly. I'm not exaggerating. And the idea that we're at a place, I think, in human evolution where we are considering peace and really having academic departments that are willing to consider it is a huge testament to where we're heading, I think, as a human race. I do believe that. What's fun about George is that he's been in the trenches of peace studies in this world of looking at peace academically, I would say from, really the early stages of it. He's at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at Notre Dame. He helped found the program there. And he has been so generous, he and all of his colleagues, to then open it up to invite people like me, colleges like Valencia, to come in and find out how can we do this ourselves. So that's our relationship with George. In addition to this, he's a person who spent a year consulting at the UN, working with the US State Department to help them see how do we deal with a North Korea, right? How do we deal with Iran, these rogue states that aren't behaving internationally like good neighbors, so we say, right? And so he's an expert on this. So he's going to give us this talk. Now, this is his idea. Is peace possible in a world of terrorism? I'm like, all right, let's talk about that. And there'll be a healthy Q&A when you can, really ask him questions, because this is a man who's in the trenches. And I'll just tell you an example. This morning, I have babies at home, a 2- and 3-year-old, so I don't even know the news. So he walks up and, the media's been calling me this morning with the death of Gaddafi to find out what my take is on it. Right? The Libyan former dictator was just, killed. All right. So this is a person who's in the trenches who would be consulted on a daily basis by the media to find out what does this mean. Okay. So please ask your questions and be ready to be intrigued here for the next hour. Welcome, George Lopez.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Can you hear me in the back of the room? The acoustics good? Great, thank you. In the interest of our camera people, I'll try to stay anchored. It would be better if you'd nailed my shoes to the floor, but I'll try to stay anchored. It's not usual for me to not wander a lot and chat. I'm coming to the near end of a great 3 days here at Valencia, revisiting and reconnecting with a number of faculty that we've known over the last couple of years. But more importantly, getting to meet many of you, the students and other people associated with Valencia, and I have a real great experience here. Even if they didn't have great brownies for lunch, I would say it's a real great, but the brownies have reinforced this tremendously. As Rachel mentioned, one of the things I'm delighted to be part of is the development of the Peace Studies program here and the search for peace in a world of terrible violence. And one of the things I think I like to do, both with students and with campuses that we're working on in this regard, is to say, look, let's not talk flowery ideas. Let's talk the real stuff. What kind of world do we live in? What's the nature of the challenges? Are there ways in which, where the response to the challenges has been a very strong and sometimes effective and sometimes not so effective militarized response? Are there ways in which, whatever the effectiveness of military responses, there are other routes of response where we might be able, by policy changes and some other successes, be able to make the world overall less violent. It's not so much a principled commitment to nonviolence, although many of my colleagues in peace studies have that, and I think the world's a better place for the Gandhis, Martin Luther Kings, St. Teresa's, and others we have. But the experience of building peace in most places is when you hold a peace conference to end a brutal war, the people around the table are not Gandhi, King, and St. Francis and Mother Teresa. They're scoundrels, liars, genociders, murderers, and cheats. And that's how you build peace, in negotiating with those folks. So I wanted to share with you some ideas that I think may for some be controversial, for others not fully acceptable, but are ideas, please come in, are ideas that are being batted around in the highest concerns in Washington and elsewhere that now, particularly from a U.S. point of view, a decade after 9/11, with us still knee-deep in conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, can we take a step back and decide whether or not a policy which has been called the Global War on Terror, or GWOT, as it'll be seen in these slides, whether the GWOT has been successful, where might it go, under what conditions, and what does that mean? And have that be a more shared public citizen portion of discussion, because now it's a policy that doesn't need to be made in a bunker because you don't know whether there's going to be another set of terrorist attacks on September 12th or 13th or 14th. Now, 10 years after, and having commemorated the positive and terrible negative things of 10 years after 9/11, what can we do and where should we go? Within a focus of the toughest of all questions, can there be peace in a world of terror? So let me start with what I think the serious scrutiny of peace at the collegiate level, at the policy level, has to grope with. First and foremost, we're not pie in the sky about this. We're not hold hands and let's just look into the eyes of Osama and see if we can understand one another. You and I live in a world in which it's very, very clear that a number of individuals and a group exist out there who are committed to kill us simply because we're Americans. So I don't start with pie in the skyness about peace here. We live in a tough, dirty, nasty, cruel world in certain segments of the world. I think those segments are growing increasingly smaller and narrow, but I don't doubt they still exist. But dealing with this reality in an effective peace manner doesn't derive from some magical formula that's constructed solely in government, or derives from the notion that, well, we defeated the Germans and Japanese this way in World War II, so therefore our action should be this way in the global war on terror. I think we do have 10 years of experience, which are interesting. I think we reflect on that, and we will, but I think a lot of this is going to be trial and error, and I want to suggest the principles under which the trial and error and some hunches about how to do it may be useful to us. Sure. Now, in addition to those realities, we have another one, which is that under conditions of 10 years in the war on terror, there are some things and dynamics that work out in a way in which the wider society has become kind of used to this. I look around the room. We have a number of people in the room who are under the age of 25. Proudly raise your hands. Who are those people? There you go. The vast majority, shame on you. The vast majority of people in this room under the age of 25, which means what? That 9/11 was one of the formative, if not the formative, political experience of your life. How many people have friends or relatives or who themselves fought in one or two of the campaigns, Iraq, Afghanistan? Okay? That allows some of the older people, yes, indeed, to raise their hands. Okay? So it's really tough not to be impacted by this, all right? So what we know in society happens often, particularly in U.S. society, there's a kind of entropy to war. It has a motion of its own. It keeps going on and on and on. And particularly once we cross certain thresholds in this global war on terror, when we found it, well, it goes on longer than World War II. It's going on longer than our commitment in Vietnam. I find that my students think that war is a normal form of life. It goes on every day. It's in fact become so normal in American society, you can go through the major evening news and any of the major networks for the half-hour global news program at 6:30, 7, whenever it showed here in Orlando, and there's no report of what's going on at all in Afghanistan or Iraq right now. Wars that are costing us nearly $1 trillion a year. There's no report on them whatsoever. So our first dilemma is, if we're going to talk about changing policy and changing dynamics about this, we have to realize how even unconscious it's become in our understanding of the way the world works. Many in our society also believe that the terrorism threat and actions are so extraordinary and so serious and maybe so undiscoverable. They lurk out there ready to get us in ways that we don't know, that to talk about peace in a world of terror is just incredibly misplaced. If peace occurs, it's only going to come as a luxury after we finally go and kill every single last one of them. Okay, so that's another challenge I think we face. I think we're facing right now in Iraq and Afghanistan a sort of deep societal anxiety, and that is the fear held in the highest level of governments, in our journalists, and many people in our citizenry. I don't know if we ought to quit until the job's done. And so even though the Iraqi parliament hasn't made a decision whether or not they want 20 or 30,000 U.S. advisors, you have many in the U.S. decision-making elite talking about, we've got to stay, because it's not time for us yet to come home, the job isn't done. Without discussing the idea about whether or not in some societies the decision by groups and societies to continue to kill one another decade after decade means that whether or not you're there, that local struggle is going to continue to go on. And you have to decide a time when to come home. But we're really worried about the global reach of terrorism and the fear that in any place where we're fighting it now, if we leave now, that quitting will lead to more and more terrorism, as opposed to the prospect, what if it actually leads to less, which isn't really examined. So some of these things that I think are things that really put a lot of pressure on me in making a case to you that I think we could do some things differently in winning a global war on terror. So, what do I mean by peace and the search for peace or policies that would lead to peace in a world of terror? Well, I'm not sure that there's some special definition of peace in a world of terror, but I'll choose two that I think are traditional. The first is that peace for many people is security. I want to be free from arbitrary and harsh violence that comes out of nowhere on us for no reason. Attacks like 9/11, attacks like 7/7 in Europe, in Madrid, Spain, in London, and the like. I want to be free of the global reach of groups that have no interest except to do us harm. So peace is security. That's one very important kind of peace, and we mean that particularly Western security. A second usual leg of peace is the ability to solve disputes during violence and reduce the violence and solve the grievances that led to the violence by ending the shooting. And this implies that some issues would be negotiable. And one of the dilemmas in dealing with terrorism is, particularly the new form of terrorism, tends to leave us with the impression that there aren't a lot of negotiable issues. You're Americans, I hate you, I want to kill you. It's not a lot to negotiate there. Okay. But I want to focus on these two different definitions for a minute. So, how do we get to peace as security? And how could someone like me make a claim that peace as security, which pursued the global war on terror in a number of theaters, can now give way to peace as security through other policies and methods? How can I make a case for that? Well, let's take the bull by the horns here and say that peace as security would mean an effective counterterrorism policy, as used in the language of national security elites in the U.S. and elsewhere. My first claim then would be the following. Whatever the strengths and benefits and successes of the global war on terror, and I think it's been very successful in essentially decapitating al-Qaeda, In that level of success, I don't have any problem of giving that to the data of history. But I think it's also done something else. It's conflated and confused a very diverse set of terrorist groups that exist in the globe, with all be affiliated with the al-Qaeda network or al-Qaeda-like. It's done for your age cohort, for those under the age of 25 or 30 here, exactly what my generation's mistakes were in dealing with the communist world. We interpreted every government in Africa or Latin America that went socialist as a singular extension of Russian or Chinese communism. And we put communism as a global monolithic entity, which was our enemy, as opposed to looking at the Cubas, the Venezuelas, or the Vietnams as indigenous grown national socialist revolutions which had for themselves a particular reason for being. They may be getting aid from the Russians or they may not, but they didn't have a global threat posed to the US, and they were developing things out of local circumstances. What we've done in the war on terror, I would say, is exactly what we did in the 1950s at the beginnings of the Cold War. We conflated individual kinds of groups that looked a little bit like or a lot like the main enemy and put them all in one basket. And therefore, under those conditions, with these different autonomous terror groups existing in different places, the only solution, once you chose military force in al-Qaeda, was military force against all of these. I think that was a strategic error. Secondly, there's been a dramatic undervaluation and lack of understanding of the other mechanisms for countering terrorism, and a lack of vision of the role and success of regional and international organizations in combating terrorism. Very few people understand that nearly 80% of terrorist financial resources since 2001 have been locked down by the international banking mechanism, which was given its momentum, its rules, and its training from the United Nations counterterrorism program. Not a military response, but a cooperative, legal, economic, commercial response to stripping terrorist groups of their ability to finance their operation. That is extended to a whole series of rules, regulations, and trainings which empower states to find out ways in which passports are counterfeited, to find out the criminal networks that support that kind of illicit travel and counterfeiting. Cooperation among airline systems and even the weakest security arrangements in airports in some far-flung lands to guarantee that people on the designated lists of terrorists and their aliases become listed in a way in which we can prevent their travel between a Sudan, a Nigeria, and an Afghanistan. Those kinds of things have been undervalued, understated, and underappreciated. They've gone a long way in winning a global struggle or global war on terror without firing a shot. But a third point I think needs to be emphasized here, especially in a world in which it's no secret to us in this room that we're in an economic crisis in this country. The financial and military data that all of us could have available to ourselves just by going on the web suggests a global war on terror like we've run for the last decade is absolutely unsustainable. It's unsustainable financially. It's unsustainable in terms of the strain on the U.S. military. It's unsustainable on the communities that are welcoming back these hardworking veterans and facing the economic crisis we face within our country. We've always had to make tough choices in the U.S. about what price will we pay for our security. We've been able and fortunate in the last decade to pay any amount of money under any conditions. Some of us would maintain that's led to an incredibly bloated bureaucracy within Homeland Security and other areas, which now creates such redundancies that it's time for a tough look and a hard analysis at getting the same amount of security for about 50%, 30%, 20% of the price that we paid in 2010, 2011 dollars. And let's bring the military home, regenerate, and heal, and thank them for a job well done. So, what's been the approach to the global war on terror? Two things of note as illustrated by this pyramid. The approach, particularly led by the United States in the global war on terror, was to defeat terrorist organizations and their leadership, to deny the organizations the places and safe havens in states and state support they might have, and the international factors like this ability to counterfeit, move money, and do these things through criminal organizations, to deny the assets, deny the routes of travel of that, and then ultimately to diminish the underlying conditions that would give rise to this kind of terrorism. Whether it's the ideological and, I would claim, bastardized approaches to understanding certain religions and misinterpretations of religious guidance that serve as the underlying conditions, so too the notion of having lots and lots and lots of 15 to 24-year-old males in your society who are unemployed and have nowhere to go. All of those are the underlying conditions that create and sustain certain kinds of things when the rest is there. When a fiery leader can jump up on a soapbox and say, do you want to know why you're hungry and in the streets? It's because of them. And my God tells you that now's the time for fighting the holy war, then you have these conditions. But our focus over the last 10 years has been decapitate the leaderships, break the organizations, and defeat them primarily militarily, through lots of good intelligence, law enforcement, and other things, and particularly to roll in and operationalize the other tools as we denied assets, denied functional dynamics, and diminished the underlying conditions. I think that's a reasonable pattern of what's happened that even people who dramatically disagree with my conclusions would agree is where we've been over the last decade. Now, where has this been a success? In my mind, it's been an incredibly good success in defeating the structured, functional organization, our primary enemy that aimed at the destruction of the West, Al-Qaeda. For all practical purposes, this group is destroyed as a functional organization. There will be other groups that call themselves members of Al-Qaeda. There'll be regional spin-offs and regional conflicts that call themselves Al-Qaeda. But this I like, and I hope you don't mind the personal reference, but having grown up in Brooklyn, New York in the 50s and 60s when if you were going to be safe in certain neighborhoods where I lived, you had to be a member of a gang and wear a certain jacket, and some gangs were more prominent than others, you wanted to play both ends against the middle sometime and sort of wear a jacket that looked a lot like the Sharks, but it wasn't exactly the Sharks, but it got you through certain territories. And in my case, you didn't wear a jacket with a shark because it's one thing to be beaten up by the gang members. It's a very different thing to be beaten up by your mother who told you I didn't tell you, I told you don't wear those jackets, okay? So I sort of negotiated this in my own environment. We had a lot of people who were like shark wannabes, because that was a way to negotiate and survive for a while when you're 13 or 14 years old. There's a lot of Al-Qaeda wannabes out there, but they're not the Al-Qaeda that attacked us in 9/11. And they don't either have the capacity, scope, or reach to do so. Which brings us to a second group. You might be saying, for example, okay, I'm willing to accept that Al-Qaeda is reasonably defeated, but I'm looking at us still running into roadside bombs in Afghanistan. I'm looking at us still being attacked and our allies in Iraq being attacked. And some of these allies, particularly in Iraq, call themselves Al-Qaeda of Mesopotamia. So aren't they the problem? Well, I classify these folks a little bit differently. That is, there's a number of, and yes, some of them are Islamic as Al-Qaeda, Islamic resistance fighters to the presence of Western troops on their soil, and they very effectively have used terrorism tactics. But they do so within that geographic confine and within that geographic confine alone. And their first level is resistance. Their first instinct is nationalism. Their second instinct is get rid of these Western invaders. And their third instinct, a little bit like my friends and I with our jacket, is let's take on the ideas, the dynamics, and maybe even occasionally the aid that might be given us by advisors from al-Qaeda. But good policy analysts should tell you there's a difference between the hardcore al-Qaeda we fought for a decade and are defeated and local terrorism resistance fighters that look like they have the same kinds of techniques and occasionally spout the same kind of propaganda, because they're different in kind. And policy is supposed to distinguish among terrorist groups that are different in kind. And then we have yet a third, what I would call, and this is the most dangerous part of policy, it seems to me, is that there is a host of groups that have existed and fought within their locales in times much prior to 9/11 because they had localized disagreements, and many of their members were part of Islamic resistance movements or Islamic fundamentalism. The most significant one that I've had direct experience with is Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, because my institute has done a lot with Christian-Muslim dialogues within Mindanao and the Philippines. Look at the founding date of Abu Sayyaf, 1991. When the Philippine government, in late September of 2001, said to a group of international reporters that the skirmishes in Mindanao were indicative of the larger global struggle of radical Islamicists, some of whom may be affiliated with al-Qaeda, you began to see that the Philippines was one of the new forum in which al-Qaeda and the West were doing battle. Nothing could be more historically inaccurate. But it was in the interest of certain Middle Eastern states to say that Hamas and Hezbollah are like al-Qaeda, or folks in Indonesia to say that Imam al-Azia is like al-Qaeda. But this is a different type of struggle with more localized actors who may look a little bit like the way they wear it in the jacket, but guess what? They invented their own jacket even before al-Qaeda was founded, much less before al-Qaeda attacked. And we've conflated these into part of the global war on terror. And then lastly, especially in Europe, there's been a concern of late with homegrown terrorism, with the only real concern in the United States being Somali connections to terrorism and recruitment of young people out of Somali resident groups in Minneapolis. It's happened very, very few other places in the United States. Our situations are very different here than ghettoized immigrant communities in Paris, London, and elsewhere. Now, in these four terrorist groups, therefore, what I'm claiming is that the victory against al-Qaeda needs to reshuffle the deck in strategic policy terms for how you wage a global struggle, not a war, but a global struggle, to defeat the remnants that may exist of al-Qaeda and other groups that are bent on attacking the United States under certain conditions. More and more and more resources are being waged effectively, reorganized, with military not being primary, but intelligence, law enforcement, economic, and other means changing the spectrum in which we deny and diminish as the primary tools, because we can, and because the need for direct military struggle is now very, very limited. And that denial of assets and resources and increasing the amount of attention to diminishing underlying conditions, international supports, is where the action ought to be. We can talk about how and where and why that might happen. But it's a strategic difference from the first pyramid we showed you. It means less and less reliance on an already overstretched military and more focus strategically on a set of global cooperative agreements that work in our favor, particularly using intelligence, economic, and other resources. Now, that's the first dynamic of peace as security. What do we mean as peace as conflict resolution in the way in which you raise the terrible question, can you ever negotiate with terrorists? because we've lived in a discussion in this country for a long while in which, no, there's only one thing you can do, which is destroy. You can't negotiate. Well, this is a research project that my team did and a number of other teams in various places did. 85% of all global terrorist operations, global terrorist events, over the last 5 or 6 years that have occurred, as published yearly in the U.S. State Department data bank, shows that if you look at the locales in which those terrorist groups unfold their activity, they occur in places that have had protracted internal violence prior to 2001. In other words, terrorism most manifests itself in places of ongoing civil war or violence that's just short of civil war. That leads some of us who do a lot with conflict resolution to say, gee, I think the issue may not be let's go and attack the terrorists where the events unfold. Maybe we can dramatically reduce the terrorism by applying the mechanisms by which we actually end the conflict of which terrorism is a part. That the enemy here might be protracted internal civil war and the unwillingness of parties to solve it, and recognizing that the times when you can solve civil war, what are you left with? You're left with some extreme elements on each side, what we call the spoilers, that you probably have to deal with. So yes, when the IRA signed its agreement with the British to end for some people, they'd consider it a 40-year struggle. Some people, if you were really, really Irish, considered it a 400-year struggle against the British, okay? When you ended that and you found it working in your favor to sign the treaty, you knew you were going to go back to the local pub and find people who were interested in still going out shooting and bombing, and you had to deal with those spoilers, okay? Effective conflict resolution may help us on 85% of the terror problem we have globally. So our resources maybe should be put into ending protracted conflicts. And I'd say this, again, on the basis of the Philippine experience. We can't let long-term friends, like the Philippine government, continue to historically manipulate what's happening in their country and saying, we can't sign a peace treaty with the Islamic separatists because that would be surrendering in the global war on terror, and we know you don't want to do that. But if you only give us more military aid and advisors, we'll keep up the struggle and defeat them. Okay? I saw an Israeli T-shirt very soon after 9/11 which said, now the U.S. understands. Now you're part of our war. We are and should be one of Israel's great friends and supporters. But we shouldn't be duped into the notion that somehow we have to be attacking Hamas because Hamas is part of the global terror conspiracy that wants to do us in. That's historically inaccurate. But it's part of the 85%. The other 14%, yeah, we have a problem. We have a problem over the last decade with radical terror violence that's anti-Western, but is housed within communal dislocations and a lack of effective political systems for including multiple voices in their political order. One word can summarize this, most recently, Pakistan. Okay? Pakistan is a system that's existing despite itself, with a tremendous amount of internal dislocations. And we have to help Pakistan become an effective state in order to deal with its radical elements that seem to think they have to be at both war with their state and at war with the West, because they incorporate a lot of the 14%. Now, what are the challenges for us then to build peace in a world on terror? We have to isolate and deal with this 14% and work with particular governments that are faced with this challenge, like Pakistan, without turning these difficulties into an all-out civil war. We have to help settle civil wars and apply the methods that we know to effective conflict resolution in civil wars, and we have a lot of good track record with success here. And make sure that we're not sidelined in a way in which the spoilers take us off track. How do we know this might be successful? a very, very important study by the Rand Corporation in the United States, published in 2008. From 1968, when terrorism first raised its very, very large, effective head in the global order, till almost 40 years later, the analysts of Rand looked at 268 terrorist groups. This is why some of us who are older look at you, whose political experience is only from 9/11, and say terrorism has actually always been with us. It's just taken different form, and it's grown a little bit more spectacular. But we can all live through this honest, okay? Look what happens in how terrorism ends. Almost half the time, 43%, terrorist groups and their contending governments and people reach a political agreement in which the violence ends. Ireland, Basque separatists, Italian Red Brigade, and on and on. Policing, increasing the effectiveness of the police to arrest and apprehend criminal terrorism within its own boundaries, has had victory over terrorism. Read Japan and the Japanese Red Army, Germany and the Baader-Meinhof gang, Argentina and the Montoneros, Uruguay and the Tupamaros. Some of these groups some of you have never heard of because these were the quiet victories on terrorism by use of intelligence, law enforcement, economics, and non-military means. Yes, 1 out of every 10 terrorist groups has disappeared and ended terrorism because they were militarily defeated. And yes, because military force and another 7% essentially decimated an international terror group. So we're not saying military doesn't play a role here, but let's look at the real data. Those who are willing to say, I don't think peace has any role in here, it's just soft-hearted leftism, let's get on the task and get to it. The task historically that's worked has been the reintegration of radical fighters into normal politics and finding a way to do business through the ballot box and not the barrel of a gun. So, this pushes our ideas of transformative conflict to saying that our work, if we're going to reduce terrorism and reduce the internal violence that leads to it, means we've got to be at work at building mediating voices and institutions within societies, particularly among religious communities where radicalism of religion helps generate terrorism. We've got to clarify the cultural values and beliefs that are at stake and lead people to believe, particularly in Pakistan and elsewhere, the West is not out to undermine or assault your religious values. And there's yet a lot of evolution and dialogue between us and you that needs to go on. But it can't go on through the technique of terrorism. And we've got to take and separate out those who believe that that dialogue is useless and will fight to the death, the spoilers, and separate them from those who can engage and evolve into non-military means of competition and dialogue in what they consider a battle of ideas and a battle of cultural realities. I think because terrorism in that type 2 I mentioned occurs in the areas where there's a lot of U.S. and Western troops, it's time to reevaluate and think about lessening our footprint in some of those areas and map the data and see whether or not terrorism declines. I'm sorry to say I do believe that for the next 20 years at least, various Iraqi groups will find new and terrible ways to kill one another, whether or not we're there. And we have to let go of the notion that somehow, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, we have any impact on this at all, save for the fact that we're bankrolling the government. Okay? We have to lessen the footprint. And we have to understand that the forces of change in societies that are engaged in a lot of violence are essentially local. They're not extended, monolithic, global networks of fear, of individuals that we fear that operate in a way in which even when you kill Al-Qaeda, somehow it's still alive. And they will find a way to get us. We have to recognize that the utility of military force has been a particular mindset and in the midst of a struggle that's been dominated by suicide terror, but suicide terror, like other forms of weaponization, will soon have an end of its day. And we're living through a very tough time period. What's the end game? If we're going to talk serious policy, this is the big buzzword. What's your end game? If we decide to go for peace instead of military in a war on terror, what's the end game, people ask me. Well, it's very, very simple. I want a situation in which every government in the world is committed to and has the capacity to combat terrorism within its own borders, and it does so. So if I want to increase, whether it's Sudan's capacity to do this and their commitment to do it, or Yemen or Somalia, do I need to be sending armies, or do I need to be sending bureaucrats, which increase the capacity of the banking system? Do I need to be sending, through the Justice Departments of the United States and Germany and Norway, a collection of very talented police officers that train these people to run effective police systems, not only in terms of tracking down bad guys, but that when you have bad guys, you don't torture them in prison and beat the hell out of them so that their children become the next generation of terrorists. Okay. The second part of the end game, to understand that our expense in money and precious resources of ourselves and our lives invested in this declines dramatically over time. Not because we pull out and we're scared, not because we got tired, not because we're weak and unable to project force, but because we actually recognize where policy is a success. And I worry we're at some moments where we're unable to do that. In the end, it's not just the end of terror that we're looking for, but a new set of mechanisms, methods, and relationships which is going to allow the grievances in certain communities to come forth, but not be expressed by radicals only through the barrel of a gun. But there be mechanisms there in which they can be heard and not immediately crushed by their own intelligence officers or by foreign armies. If we have that kind of dynamic, if we have an end game where governments are competent and committed to end terror with our help, at the end of the day, you might even call it peace. The floor is open. Questions, curiosities, challenges? Please.
I wanted to give an observation. That graphic you put up, the pie chart, if you turned it over, then you notice that it would be a peace sign. I didn't notice that when you're doing it.
Actually, I didn't notice that. Are you saying I have like this psychological thing built in that I'm just sort of subliminal kind of? Makes me very, very nervous. But thank you. I'm going to go back and play with the PowerPoint and check that out. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Well, let me ask the obvious then. What do you think of the events of today?
Of the events of this day?
Oh,
today. Yeah. I don't think it was anything other than inevitable. You know, we've just put out from my institute, the Kroc Institute, a new set of papers, Peace Policy we call it, which is a debating forum. And I have two good colleagues who argue that the NATO intervention was helpful but went too far, another who claims it's illegal, and I claim that the NATO intervention saved so many more lives than it would have had it not happened. That as much as I believe there's too much reliance on military force, this is as close to a just war as I can see. I happened, because I just came off of 10 months working for the UN Sanctions Group, I was very much in the room when Secretary Rice and other people were formulating the original sanctions policy against Libya. We knew there's ways in which that cut Gaddafi off on his knees financially, but we also saw the intelligence data of these tanks and things moving to Misrata. I'm convinced the day that NATO started bombing, as a result of that Security Council resolution, we saved at least 20,000 lives that day in Misrata. And at the end, I think the decision of NATO to say the only way we can protect civilians is to absolutely destroy Gaddafi's ability to wage war on his people, that bombing was the best surgical bombing the West has done in a very, very long time. But here now's the peace challenge. What do I think about the events of the day? There's a lot of good outsiders working with Libyan people, working through the tough choices now. What do you do with the loyalists? Well, the first thing you do is disarm them. And not only disarm them, but this is a society awash in weapons. We need a buyback program for weapons that's very, very, very lucrative. We need intelligence sources to help us with the shoulder-to-air rocket launchers that have disappeared and figure out, did these things go to Chad or where did they go? Because you use some very dangerous things in large numbers, and people are working on that from Interpol on out. We need to help the Libyan people understand the mistakes, which I think they're aware of some neighbors. You know, Paul Bremer, bless his intentions, came in and decided if you were a card-carrying member of Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party, you had no role in the future of Iraq, and fired in one day 325,000 police, army, and civil service workers, the day after, all of whom became enemies of the United States in Iraq. Okay? To understand a society that lives unto a dictator is to understand that if you're an accountant who wants to work for government, you have to be a card-carrying member of the party. Otherwise, you don't have a job. Yes, there are a group of hardcore loyalists, I'm sure, to Gaddafi, who still want to fight to the death, even though they're defeated. You can find those out pretty regularly. You can find out the Libyan officials with blood on their hands. But that's a 0.5% of the people who didn't side with the rebels. The rebels themselves, with the help of outsiders, should now be able to say, here's the amnesty. Turn in the guns, participate in the electoral process. We're trying to establish a society of law and order and democracy, and we're going to learn by doing and learn by doing it together because we're all Libyans. We're not Gaddafyites. In fact, we even may want to rethink our commitment to tribe versus nation. And it's going to be a slow-growing process. The same, I think, is going to unfold in a much more bloody manner in Syria within the next 6 to 18 months. Okay? But it's clear that Assad's days are numbered. The people that I still have some contact with within Treasury and in the UN financial system say Assad's available currency reserves have now dropped below the 30-day level. This is a guy who had resources before the first set of Western sanctions went in place in February, that he probably had 6 months of spendable resources. Okay? Now he's down to just below 30 days because that's how tight the financial net is around him and around some of his people. Well, when you're running out of money and, as he's doing, asking the big families to pledge money to the survival of the government, this guy's in trouble. Unfortunately, he's still got so many loyal people that are willing to stand on their roofs and shoot their own citizens. That's a dilemma. Okay? But I think the way of Gaddafi is going to be the way of Assad. And it's quite unfortunate, but dictators don't go quietly. I think Libya has great potential. I think there'll be some nastiness, but I hope it can be curbed. I think those of us who are citizens in the United States, a quick historical checkpoint here, in a world of much lower violence, to be sure, but still a checkpoint. Our own victory over the British occurred in 1783. We didn't have the Continental Congress build the Constitution until 1789. What do we have in the interim? A number of the southern states say, well, I know we fought together as colonies, but I don't know if I want to be part of a country. We had the Shays Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, and these various other breakouts of small rebellions that people worried would break apart the Union. But it took us 6 years to get there, and even then it was a tentative system, and it's a system that didn't solidify until 1865 when our own Civil War was over. Nobody wishes that on these new governments, but democracy isn't instantaneous. But revenge doesn't have to be the first step. And that's what I think outsiders can be most helpful to the Libyans with. on a day like today. Yes?
Do you think the Cuban government has about the same amount of loyalists as Libya's does?
Not in the same way. No, not in the same way. There are a number of Cubans that feel very, very strongly that they have been singularly isolated in ways that have been unfair relative to any other country in Latin America with the U.S. embargo. They don't look forward to the day when all these folks from Miami return and say, I'm reclaiming my land, okay? Because they lived there for 50 years and tried to do the best they can. I think there are a number of quiet groups that are working on Cuban reconciliation that can be quite helpful with this. But the real locus of control for how well will the post-Castro transition go rests in the United States, not in Cuba. Don't worry about guerrilla groups forming in Cuba to defend Cuban socialism. They've had enough of socialism, thank you. But what did in socialism more than anything else there was the U.S. embargo. So let's not make the same mistake we made with Iraq, where somehow we thought when we went in and invaded Iraq, the embargo didn't matter. That was our way of coping with the dilemma at that time. The inability of Iraq as a society to come back economically was more related to the sanctions than it was the war of 2003. And we didn't have any plan in effect for how you build a post-sanctions economy. Not the least of the reasons being is when you have a sanctioned economy, the people who are really making the money are the criminal networks that underscore all of this. And there's a lot of criminal networks that have relationships between Colombia, Cuba, Mexico, and the United States. Yes, in the back.
You mentioned Assad. What policy recommendations would you advocate for intervention in Syria?
I think the economic intervention and encirclement we have of the Syria regime is the most appropriate at the moment. I don't think you can have a NATO-style dilemma like this or decision like we had in Libya. I think they're drastically different situations. I know the U.S. has been working very hard to get Arab League condemnation and isolation of Assad. That's very, very critical. I wish the European sanctions that were announced on Labor Day didn't have their effectiveness planned for November 1. They should have, the oil embargo in particular should have been in place right away. I think the Europeans believed if we show Assad how bad it's going to get, he'll yield. Instead, he bought more time on the international oil futures market, and that reinforced his resistance. And that was a critical mistake, but that's done now. Europe's trying slowly to tighten these, but this is a tough haul. Sir, did you have your hand up?
I did,
yeah.
So I'm just, as I was hearing you talk about Libya, I keep flashing on what's happening in this country because there are a lot of, there are a number of well-heeled loyalists to the imperial oligarch regime in this country. That so I see that without as much violence, but I see the same thing playing out in this country. And how do you keep one faction from becoming the interest group, the next interest group that takes over, and then the next interest group, and the next interest group?
Yeah, I think two things historically have worked. One is you very, very quickly welcome an international set of advisors from the UN and regional structures that have had experience in dealing with this. And the second thing you do is you call as much as you can within the next 30 to 60 days the all-factional national conference, because you want everybody for a while in the glass house expressing their concerns, saying whether or not they're willing to be a minority party or not. They don't have to agree with the policies, but they have to agree with the new methods, which is nonviolent approach to conflict resolution. Instead, if they're going to take to the hills with the guns, then that's their declaration and they have to live with the consequences. But you don't decide that this will be a victor's politics. Only the rebels will make up the new government. That's destined to fail. So I think it's the national conference with international support, with lots of international experts that help with the loyalists, both internal and external to Libya.
In that area, what are your thoughts on Israel
beacon in there or a hot spot, and how would that situation get resolved?
I think if I had the answer to that, boy, would I be popular, because this has been a 60-year struggle. But I'll tell you, since you asked the good question, in this country, this administration, I don't mean this as a partisan thing because I have a lot of disagreement with Obama about some things. This president has been more willing than others to have the behind closed door, direct conversations with both Palestinians and Israelis that no other president's been willing to have. And he's taken the heat for it. And the conversations go like this. First, this is doable. You know it's doable. You know what the plan has been for over 2 decades. The only reason you're continuing to be stubborn is because your own power rests there. Look at what's going on around you, and power can no longer protect you. It's not even protecting dictators. Okay? And that's nasty stuff to say one-on-one with leaders. It's been said to Abbas, and it's been said to Netanyahu. Okay? Secondly, we've made clear to them they can't keep making their region more terrible for the other without increasing how terrible you make it for yourself. The Israelis need the Palestinians to be a secure people in order to guarantee Israeli security. The Israelis need the Palestinians to be a state in order to guarantee that Israel can be a state. And that's been the dilemma from 1948 on, that no one's been willing to say that to them. You can't keep making this world more dangerous for them without making it more dangerous for yourself. Okay? Your security, your future is inextricably linked. I don't care what your religious foundations say. Politically, socially, economically, there are no alternatives. These are two societies that cooperate on the flow and management of water like no other two societies in the globe cooperate. They run a complex aqueduct system between these two entities while they're willing to slit one another's throat. How does that make any sense? Well, if you're able to do it at the aqueduct level, why can't you do it in the public, social, political? Only because you choose not to. So we've got to be tougher as outsiders. They've got to be more serious as insiders. And they have to listen to their respective populations, because the popular opinion in Palestine and the popular opinion in Israel is enough already, thank you. No more killing, build 2 states, build a future. Last question in the back, sir.
Should we be focusing on our security? Is there a better way to improve our security?
Is there a better way to improve our security? Yes. Increase the quality of dialogue you and I as citizens demand of our coming candidates on all sides in 2012. Okay? I lived in, some others here lived in a generation in the 60s and 70s where we watched political candidates for the presidency say, I'm going to be tougher on the Russians and they'll be tougher on the Russians. They're going to be soft on the Russians. I'm going to be tough on the Russians. Don't let candidates get away with this dynamic in which I can protect you and give you security because I'm not going to cut the military budget. I'm not going to pull us out of here, here, and here. No. Ask what's the new dynamic of security that uses global cooperation, financial methods, and various other ways in which there's less a footprint rather than more. And don't let politicians of any persuasion, Obama or not, get away with the notion of, by God, don't worry about me. When in doubt, I'll kill him with a drone. Okay? No, that's too easy. Let's get down to some serious work in an era of serious problems. Thank you very much.